past is present, and how we got here. I was trained as a mathematician once, but I'm a journalist now, and abstractions are not my cup of tea. I'm a journalist, I prefer stories, so I will just maybe pick one or two anecdotes from my book. The reason I'm here is this is a non-fiction festival. I have a book on the Narmada coming out, just to illustrate what I think are some of the themes that will go into this topic. And the book on the Narmada is a book where I followed the footsteps of the pilgrims who actually circumambulate the Narmada. The traditional pilgrimage is 3 years long, and people actually walk the entire length of the river. And because of this, every place, every rock, every town on the banks of the Narmada has gained a certain mythology, a lore of stories, of history, of connections. And from among these stories, it is possible to pick up sort of your own variation of the past, depending on how you want your present to be. And I think it is these choices that we make that says something about our present and how we got here. And today what we are facing as a country. Say some 40 or 50 kilometers from Bhopal is the town of Hoshangabad. Some of you may have heard of it. It's on the banks of the Narmada. Exquisite ghats, a sleepy town, very different from your bustling North Indian towns. And it is named after Hoshang Shah, a Sultan of the Malwa. Obviously, as soon as you come across a name like that, you can guess that the BJP wants the name changed. You know, they want a history, a present and a past where, of course, there were no Muslim rulers and no Muslim terms sort of soil our geography. That is the way they look at our present. So their justification, because in this country we always need justifications, to actually want the name changed. An excavation somewhere near Hoshangabad which uncovered a small settlement named Narmadapura. That forms their basis for renaming Hoshangabad as Narmadapuram. But the problem is, if you've actually been to Hoshangabad, spent some time there, you realize that this way of looking at the past is a very partial view of a very partial truth. I don't know if any of you have ever taken the train from the north to the south, from Delhi to Tamil Nadu. You have to go past Bhopal to Itarsi, and the line passes through Hoshangabad. This is the sort of spine of the Indian Railways as it runs across the country. And from the Indian Railways, from the train, you can actually in Hoshangabad see this sheer rock cliff rising straight out of the earth. And it's called Adamgarh, that rock face. And between Bhopal and Hoshangabad is a place called Bhimbetka. Some of you may have heard of it. Taken together, Adamgarh and Bhimbetka form some of the oldest cave shelters in this country, with some of the most exquisite cave paintings. A history dating back to thousands of years of continuous settlement. The art is exquisite. So is the aura of these places. You know, they have in some sense, they are naturally sacred. They don't draw upon any religious tradition to become sacred. And if you look at it, I think if anybody can call upon this heritage as their past, it is the tribal inhabitants of the Narmada Valley. And from this perspective, Narmadapuram seems rather a sidelight in the history of this whole valley. So it's a question of which past we choose to decide how we want to shape our present. But this choice of the past and how do we sanctify it has immense consequences. And this became obvious to me somewhere further along the Narmada, in a place called Omkareshwar. Again, some of you may have heard it. It's set on a small island on the Narmada. This is where all pilgrimages of the Narmada end, on the Omkareshwar island. This is where Shankara gained enlightenment. And if you look at Shankara's geography, which sort of describes the Indian subcontinent, Omkareshwar is the Nabi. It is the heart of Shankara's view of Indian geography. And right here, there is a Jyotirling temple. Some of you again may have heard of Jyotirling temples. Kedarnath was one example. These are one of the most sacred shrines of Hinduism. When I went to Omkareshwar and walked into the Jyotirling temple, this was part of actually an episode on NDTV, which is still on NDTV. It's worth looking at it. And when I walked in, and we were shown around by the heir of the JP family, the temple and the island were going through a process of refurbishment. And JP was doing it because JP has also built the dams on the Narmada. JP has also built your Grand Prix track here at Yamuna, also the Yamuna Expressway. So they were improving the temple. And when you walk in, you suddenly find that the old stone floor is being covered by marble. And the stone columns and the stone pillars and those lovely exquisite ceilings, stone carvings, have all been covered by a prefab roof with indoor lighting. And we ended up asking him, did you consult an architect, an archaeologist in this regard? He said, no, we used in-house expertise. Now, what is the in-house expertise of the JP Group? They build hotel lobbies. So, where we have come to in this country, depending on how we look at the past, is that we have managed to shape one of our most exquisite temples in the shape of a hotel lobby. And what I'm saying is that this view of politics and culture is what allows us today to imagine Narendra Modi as Prime Minister. The same view that allows you to imagine an exquisite temple as a hotel lobby. We are looking at the cultural manifestation of a past that has created immense problems for us. And this is the way I look at the topic today. And I will leave it to everybody to offer their own views, and we will start with Sri Rajmohan Gandhi.
Thank you, Atosh. I hope I am being heard. So the past is present. And this study of mine about Punjab's history from the death of Aurangzeb 1707 to partition and independence in 1947, of course, covers 240 years. But a couple of things that have relevance to today's situation, what I will speak about. All of us here have heard about the Radcliffe line. And we've all heard, or maybe some of us have not heard, of this well-known poem by Auden about this man Radcliffe who comes to India and draws this line. And we've been told that there is this indiscriminately drawn line, and some houses were half on this side, half on that side, and this Englishman or Welshman or Scotsman or whatever came and did this. But that is a very small part of the truth. What we should recognize is that Radcliffe was the chair of a 5-man commission. There were 4 judges in addition to Radcliffe, and of these 4 judges, 2 were nominated by the Congress and the Akali Dal. One was Justice Mahajan, the other was Justice Harnam Singh, and 2 other judges were nominated by the Muslim League. There was Justice Deen Muhammad and Justice Muhammad Munir. So there were 4 distinguished Indian judges, and predictably, when it came to dividing Punjab, it was agreed, by the way, by all sides. The Muslim League, the Congress, the British, the Akalis agreed, reluctantly or whatever, they agreed that yes, there would be a partition and a line has to be drawn. But these 4 Indian judges in this 5-member commission, predictably, as I said, cancelled each other's verdicts. The 2 nominated by the Congress and the Akali Dal took one stand, and the other 2 took another stand, and the 2 of them wanted almost all of Punjab to be given to India. The other 2 wanted all of Punjab to be given to Pakistan. And so it was left to Justice Radcliffe. So while we blame Justice Radcliffe, we forget one very important fact, that these 4 distinguished Indian judges were unable and unwilling at that time to sit together and evolve a consensus. Not one of the 4 judges said to the other 3 judges, look, there is this very serious situation. As citizens of Punjab, residents of Punjab, as judges, we are not lawyers, we are not members of political parties, we are judges. Can we sit together and find some kind of consensus? That consensus was not attempted. And I mention this because in today's disputes in Telangana or Andhra, Seemandhra, deputations come from Telangana to Delhi. Deputations come from Rayalaseema and Seemandhra to Delhi. There are demands and there are threats and there are fasts and there are ultimatums. But we haven't learned lessons from the tragedy of Punjab or similar tragedies. Where are the distinguished figures, political, non-political, from civil society, from law, from the juridical world, to say, look, we, the residents of Andhra, all of Andhra, we have to figure this out and propose some kind of consensus solution. That does not happen. So that is one point I want to make that connects what I've written about Punjab and today's India. And the other one is as follows. Many of us have our understanding, our knowledge of how partition took place. But how many of us are aware that one of the very major issues in Punjab, I'm talking about undivided Punjab, which from Attock to Delhi, you know, there was at one time, Delhi was part of Punjab. From 1858 to 1911, Delhi was administered as part of Punjab by the British. And then, for a long time, the Punjabi Muslims, who were a majority in the province, If we are to think of Punjab's communities in religious terms, that's a very inadequate way of thinking of it, but still it is done, and in some ways it is useful to do so. The Muslims were more than 50% of all of Punjab. They were much more than 50% in Western Punjab, but in all of Punjab, they were over 50%. And the Hindus came next, and the Sikhs were about 13, 14, 15%, depending on whose figures you take. But the Punjabi Muslims were very slow to accept the idea that there should be a Pakistan. They were extremely reluctant, and they were converted relatively late in the day. But one major factor that persuaded the Muslims of Punjab to go for Pakistan was as follows. Because the Hindus and the Sikhs, who were by and large better off, by and large better educated, they had positions and places in schools and colleges and in the Punjab government service vastly exceeding the proportion that their numbers might have indicated. And there was a party called the Unionist Party. In many ways, it was a bad party. Why was it bad? It was pro-empire. Why was it bad? It was pro-feudal. But there was one thing very good about the Unionist Party. It had, beg your pardon? It opposed partition, and it had Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus all together. The Congress Party in Punjab was above all a Hindu party. Congress Party in Punjab in those days was like the BJP today. It really was. It was a Hindu party, and it was an urban party. But the Unionist Party, yes, it was feudal, bad. Yes, it was pro-empire, bad, but it had Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs under one umbrella. And the leader of the Unionist Party, a man called Fazli Hussain, proposed some very modest quotas for Muslims in government jobs and in medical college and government college Lahore. And the Congress Party, the other Hindu parties and the Sikh parties were absolutely up in arms. I'm not saying that was the chief explanation, but I wanted to mention that just as we have the quota question today, the reservation question today, even at that time, the unwillingness to respect demography, to respect democracy was a factor in the tragedy that resulted. So I'll stop with that.
How we view partition is not the way, is not the first or the second generation, but the third and the fourth generations. What came as a revelation was the whole partitioning of our own memories. And in many ways, a lot of the stories or the contributors who came up did say, but I was not born then. I've heard these stories, they are like fairy tales. But what's more interesting was that came from Bangladesh and Pakistan, which was like, I really don't know much about 47 because for me, partition starts from 71. Or for me, history starts from 47. So how do we negotiate with history is something I'm still learning to figure. But recently what I came across was this film that's just come out on YouTube and gone really viral, which is basically called When I'm 20. I Am 20. It's about a few young people who were shot by the films division for a documentary in 67 when they were 20-year-olds, and they were all kids born in 15th August 1947. So in many ways they were the Midnight Children. And this film is a film by the state. It's usually shown in the film halls before a feature film that would begin. And in 67, I came across some views, and tell me which of them have changed. You see the planning today is very lopsided. Security means a government job like a IAS or an army. And with now the pink slips flowing around, we know how that is. I would like to marry my boss's daughter. Industry should not be built on at the cost of agriculture. The vegetable prices are going up. Hopefully tomorrow something will happen. Today is precarious. Now when I see this in 2013, I believe the past is the present. And the cliche is that the past is an experience and the today is an experiment. I sometimes feel that the present is basically an experience in progress. Because this was a film that was made in 67 by a state missionary known for its propaganda, but shown very freely across cinema halls where people talked about that I'm not too hopeful about this country, the planning is lopsided, I don't have any dreams for India. And it's shown as a propaganda film. Cut to 75 emergency. We know all that happened during the emergency when the lights went off and censorship was clamped. I mean, think about it this way. I mean, the demolitions happened because Delhi was becoming a Paris, or so we were told. 30 years later, Bombay became a Shanghai. 10 years after that, the Trident lampposts made Calcutta into a London. And 4 days from now, we don't know what Delhi is going to be. So, it's still a work in progress. It's still an experiment in progress. And what I feel now, especially with the gentleman next to me, is that censorship is not an issue anymore. I think we don't need a Harry D. Penna anymore, because Harry D. Penna was the chief censor officer. You had to get your editorials passed by the censor officer before you could publish it in your thing. But I don't think we need a Harry D. Penna anymore. We have an in-house Harry D. Penna anyway. And the kind of censorship that is now clamped is not really clamped by the state. I think it's pretty self-censored. So we know what line to take, how far to go, or we are told to go. So, for me, I think the past isn't present as an experiment with with a remixed version. From black and white, we move to full colored HD, but it's still an experiment in progress. We are on the treadmill. We are just trying to be leaner and fitter, but we are still on the treadmill.
I was struck by what the complete continuity in the conversation that went from Mr. Rajmohan Gandhi to Hartosh and to Vishwajit. I'm going to speak about a different kind of partition. In 1949, when the Constitution was being ratified, Dr. Ambedkar made a statement where he said, "Today we are giving equal rights in politics to everyone, while we deny them equal rights in social and economic sphere." And in 1949, when he said that, how prescient he would have been, because when we look at India today, much of what he said is kind of playing out in front of us. When we became independent, we had roughly about 18% of the people were literate and about 80% were living below poverty line. Today we are counted among the emerging economies. As we speak, every second a new mobile subscription is being bought, every minute 20 bikes are being bought, every hour cars are being bought. For a poor country, we buy 800 tons of gold, and we have transitioned quite a bit. There was a time when the choice for an airline ticket was choosing between a cancelled flight and a delayed flight, and now we have 2,000 flights landing in this country. So when you look at this India, you wonder, somehow it seems like it was ordained, it was an orderly transition. Most of Indians, 50% of Indians who were born after 1990, wouldn't know of a scarcity India, wouldn't know of a diffident India, wouldn't know of a troubled India, because they come from a different space. But none of these things happened in an orderly or ordained fashion. Every change in India has come in the wake of a crisis. When we got independent, we were importing food. We knew our poverty was located in agriculture, but we didn't fix it, because the reigning theory then was that investment of technology and investment in agriculture would enrich the rich. So we waited till 1965 when Lyndon Johnson threatened us and called us a ship-to-mouth economy to push the Green Revolution. And when Green Revolution was pushed by Dr. C. Subramaniam, every party, including his own, opposed it. You look at, 1991 liberalization. For 40 years, we lived with this very cozy myth that the government can arrange both the politics and economics of a country. So you had a situation where you were told by the government what you could produce, where you could produce, how much you could produce, at what price you could produce, what price you could sell, who you could sell it to, when you could sell it to. And we continued with that despite the fact that for some decades we grew slower than Malawi. And when we look at China now, the whole debate about China is that they are an autocracy, that they are a totalitarian state. Yes, of course. There are a lot of liberty, freedom, these expressions. A huge portion of those expressions are based only in the dictionary in China. But remember, China leads India on every human development indicator. And what does it say of a democracy? That a totalitarian state does better on human development indicators than India. So coming back to every change in India came only when there was a crisis, only when they were pushed. In 1991, we didn't voluntarily choose an open economy, and neither did we open it fully. We chose it because we were bankrupt. We had to pledge our gold reserves with the Bank of England. And we were in a situation where we could pay only 7 days for imports. And so suddenly we found virtue in a necessity, and today there are people basking in borrowed or bestowed glory about who was the architect of reforms. The blueprint for reforms came from IMF, and it was Narasimha Rao who implemented it. So there is a whole lot of all the changes. You look at milk revolution, you look at bank nationalization, each one of them comes only at the wake of a crisis, a political and economic intersection where we are. I mean, have you ever thought of why in India we call everything a revolution? We are the only country where we have revolutions, where change is defined as a revolution, because it takes forever to get here. Each change has taken us decades to get here, and it hasn't changed at all. Between 2009, 10 and 2013, the economy was going down into it was sliding down, the government was borrowing. This government, when it came to power, was borrowing 200 crores every day in 2004. In 2013, it's borrowing 1,600 crores every day, and nobody quite knows where the money is going. So you had a situation. For 3 years, everybody was knowing what was happening. Nobody attended to it, till the rating agencies threatened us with a downgrade, and thereafter they shifted the finance minister to the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Once he went there, we got Chidambaram, and so there's a lot of conversation about reforms. But hey, look at this, from 1991 till now, we are actually worse off on all the business development indicators. We are worse off in a lot of human development indicators since 2004 till now. And despite all the money that is being spent, this is a country where 200 children die every hour. And we live with it. This is a country where 60% of the population lives on 1/6 of the national income because they are agriculturists or they work in the rural economy. This is a country where 650 million people do it out in the open. So there are these issues which never got resolved because they are not impending crises. There are these silent crises. Water is a big issue in India. This is a crisis. But we don't do it. And often when I speak, I am asked, okay, don't other countries also reform when there is a crisis? Yeah, but we have a unique speciality. We can stare at a problem and a solution simultaneously till a crisis comes. And because the political system cannot deal with the impact of choice, we are all faced with choices and we live with the consequences of the choices we make. The political system does not want to, cannot, or is incapable of making the assessment of the choices. And when it's incapable of an assessment, it waits for a crisis to come and resolve it. So we are back at that point again. So, and then there is this picture, as Hartosh said, of a man in a white charger is going to come and solve all your problems. So every time we individualize hope, we institutionalize failure. And that is primarily because we have very little conversation going on in this democracy.
I would like to compliment the person who invented this phrase, the past is present. My area is foreign policy. And I think this maxim, past is present, has a very profound and real relevance to the formulation of foreign policy of any country. Somebody said to Jawaharlal Nehru that the policy of non-alignment was his policy. He said, no, it's not my policy. It's a policy which has grown from the traditions of India. India's political tradition, India's philosophical tradition, India's ethical tradition, and general wherewithal of Indian thought and practices in the past centuries. Now, what is that tradition out of which the Panditji, I always call him, Mahatma and Panditji, out of which he culled this non-alignment policy, so-called. Now, the main themes of India's religious, philosophical, political, ethical tradition are, number one, from Kautilya and before Kautilya, whether they actually achieved peace or not, the emphasis always was on achieving peace for the people, for the state. And non-violence, of course, initially introduced in India's polity by Ashoka, a disciple of the Buddha, and reinforced very strongly by Gandhiji during the political struggle for India's independence. Nehru had inherited all this and more. Tolerance and middle path, the Buddhist teaching. And above all, the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means one world. Now, you know, my mind goes back to the Vedic prayers. One is Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina. Let everybody, the whole world be happy. And the other is, of course, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That's a general philosophical concept. The whole world is one family. Now, when you put all these elements of the long Indian tradition together, you come to the conclusion, in the circumstances of the day in which we became independent, a divided world, the East and the West in violent, virulent confrontation, the arms race going on. And Nehru rightfully drew the conclusion that to join one or the other is going to perpetuate that division. Therefore, for the happiness of the world, especially the countries which were not independent till then, a new course has to be charted, and that course is we do not enter into alliances with the Soviet Union or the American-led bloc. That became non-alignment. Nehru, in 7 or 8 words, defined foreign policy as to remain friends with everybody. Again, the same thought. But at the same time, to advance your own interest. What is your interest? Peace, security, happiness of people, development, people living together, moving together, and the world which was divided, unhappy, on the verge of a catastrophic conflict to become a world of harmony and peace and so on and so forth together. Now, foreign policy is not a static thing. The life of a nation is an evolving process. Out of the past comes the present, out of the present, future grows, and there is always a change. In a more mundane sense, when I joined the Foreign Service, 1949, the world was of 43 or 45 countries. When I finished my career as Foreign Secretary of India, there were 110 countries in the world. Today there are 200, 193 or 200. Tremendous change, not only in the geography of the world, in the political geography of the world, but also change in the nature, content, quality of international relations. Therefore, when the situation changes, the policy must evolve in accordance with the new circumstances, to fit in with the new circumstances. Now, one element of foreign policy on which Kautilya, 3,000 years ago, 2,300, 2,400 years ago, emphasized was peace, yes, but to obtain peace, you need certain power to back your foreign policy. In today's world, what is the greatest source of power? You young people, you must provide the answer. Military, that's what General Malik told you. Science and technology. Without science and technology, a military wielding swords, arrows, or obsolete guns does not constitute power today. science and technology, its application in life, general life, and in the wherewithal of the armed forces. Many people have realized this. This thought has been growing on my mind for very many years. So, a couple of years ago, I decided to put together 7 or 8 Indian scientists, the leading scientists in different branches of science and technology. And I said to them, they were all very senior people acquainted with Nehru's thinking. I said, Jawaharlal Nehru gave India at the end of his 17 years of prime ministership, he bequeathed to our country an extensive scientific base. You marvel if you really, these days young people are very critical of Nehru. I don't think they should read more of Nehru, what he did for this country. The space science he established, nuclear science he established, fertilizer factories in different parts of India, heavy industry in Haridwar here and there, all the necessities of a rapid, massive, broad-fronted advance in science and technology, he gave us that base. But we wasted our time after his time. Politics was too much with us. Quarrels, political quarrels all over the place. No investment or very little investment after Nehru's death. Only recently, I think Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, maybe thanks to what I have been saying or this book that I sent to him. Now, another aspect of foreign policy, apart from power, is the role of statesmen to create a certain balance in the world so that major conflicts are avoided.
Chandra, I'd start with you because in some sense to me, if I start with what everybody has indicated in their conversations, starting from a willingness to silence ourselves voluntarily, Nehru as a figure of mockery, our inability to take from the past, is today a crisis that will see us respond in any fashion, or is the man in the white charger an inevitability for the country?
See, first I must place on record what Mr. Rasgotra said. It's very easy now, today, to look back and say what Nehru did was wrong, what he didn't get right. You have to look at what India was. Only 18 people out of 100 could read and write. You were one of the poorest and most impoverished and ravaged nations in the place. For him to put up a world vision for India, for him to inculcate, we spoke about his vision in space and nuclear. In 1964, he appointed a Bhabha committee to look into India's core competency in technology. The Bhabha committee said that we had a core competency in both hardware and software. We were amongst the few nations in the world who used computers in India. Not just in TIFR or Calcutta, but in commercial establishments. So we were told that we had a competency in hardware and software. But given our kind of politics, we messed it up because of the license charge. We missed the hardware bus. Taiwan and Korea took that. We almost missed the software bus. And if it hadn't been for two gentlemen, Nagaraj Vittal, who produced a business model for softwares, and Mr. A.N. Verma in the Prime Minister's office who supported him, we would have had no Infosys, no Wipro, nothing. And these are the people who should be given Bharat Ratnas, and we know who all are getting Bharat Ratnas. So the people who built India over 7 decades have been regularly ignored. C. Subramaniam did the Green Revolution in 1967. He had to wait till Vajpayee became Prime Minister to get Bharat Ratna. So coming to your question is that we are in a crisis. We are in the intersection of hope and despair. Hope because we have such a fantastic demography, the potential for growth, the potential for everything. And despair because we have a completely dysfunctional democracy now. We have what I call a neural collapse, where the executive, the judiciary and the legislature are unable to function together. The legitimacy of any regime, Hartosh, comes from the scaffolding of reason. And over the last 4 years, you say reason is the last thing on the picture. We have judges who invoke the phrase collective conscience, which is another word for lynch mobs. Judges are appointed to interpret the rule of law, not to interpret collective conscience. We have 180 bills pending in Parliament. We have in the executive 12.5 lakh crore worth of projects pending. We are not creating jobs. We are adding 10 million people to the job roles. It's a huge crisis, and we are simply living on hope. So to come to the title of the session, the past is present. The present is more a triumph of hope over experience, because we're going to go through this, we'll stew in this crisis for some time. I don't think it is humanly possible for any one man to come and solve it. The problems are far more intractable. You have now introduced tribals to their rights. You have introduced farmers to their rights. You have introduced people to their rights. Now this democracy, when it starts functioning in full force, just think of what issues will crop up.
So maybe if we look at particular figures and see how we got there. How have we done this to Nehru? What has happened? How did this country change, and how have we been able to forget?
I think it is undeniable that our assessment of Nehru is also influenced by our assessment of what followed. So that is obviously a fact that we have to acknowledge. I yield to nobody in admiration for Nehru and acknowledgement of the amazing things he did. However, I think there is more to be said on that score.
Should we just throw open 1 or 2, 3 questions before we wrap up?
I really sort of was struck by some of your observations with respect to Radcliffe and the poem by Autumn, which of course is a satirical take on his role. But then we might also recollect that he sort of made some very ironic references to his rapid departure immediately after completing the task. That leads me to the question as regards the situation in the Punjab, which you've sort of looked at leading up to that event, and the kind of forms of extreme polarization which perhaps had never been witnessed before, including a kind of outbreak of what might be described as a form of radical evil. Perhaps this was the antithesis of the kind of transcendental idealism which was articulated prior to that by great philosophers and thinkers, partly as a result of the influence of perhaps Romanticism, but our own perhaps variant of that perhaps was expressed at that moment in the words of Gandhi, Tagore and others. But this curious kind of paradox, this reversion to, as it were, the worst in the self rather than at the moment of the attainment of freedom, the possible rising to our best possible self. I was wondering if you could reflect a bit further on that. A linked question perhaps might be with respect to the whole question about the partition of memory which you referred to. I have a feeling that that sort of descent, as it were, into depravity and radical evil had a kind of traumatic effect on peoples. There has been some reference to attempts at atonement, dargahs being rebuilt, the kind of cultural exchanges you referred to. But perhaps those are sort of simply steps which haven't necessarily led to a kind of full-fledged, perhaps, reckoning, even though so many years have passed. So has there been, do you feel in this, with reference to, of course, your own kind of anthology, a kind of effective regrouping or reckoning with the kind of effects of the past? The trauma, has it been reckoned with fully?
Thank you. As far as the fiendish and the horrible and indescribable savage cruelty of Punjab in 1947, you've used the word evil, and I think that's absolutely appropriate, but there's a very important factor to recognize. As you know, historians have not yet been able to arrive at a consensus on how many were killed. 500,000, 1 million, around that is the current consensus today in all, which is a huge figure. But the underreported story of Punjab of 1947 is that a great many more people were saved by Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs. That, as I did my research, emerges as the most powerful underreported story of 47, is the great numbers of Hindus and Sikhs who protected Muslim lives, concealed them, then sent them to safety, and similarly how Muslims protected Hindu and Sikh lives. So in Punjab in 1947, apart from this evil that undoubtedly occurred, there was also a great outburst of insaniyat. So this too is something that we can keep in mind. That's only one comment I'd like to make.
As for my thing, see, I don't know about atonement, but I'll give you a small instance. We were playing cards in Lahore, and the guy sitting next to me from Lahore trumped, and he put up his card and he said, "This is for 65. So I said, "What's 65? He said, "It's for Victory Day." I said, "What's Victory Day?" He said, "We won the war in 65. Now that's not the way I learned history. I learned the complete opposite. So for me, history is actually, if you look at it, is Rashomon. It's the same footage, but it changes the narrative. And that's what has happened very systematically across the states. I don't think any of the cultural interventions are steps of atonement. Neither are they certain token things that must be done by the ICCRs of the respective states. But I think a lot of it is also civil society initiatives. We try to keep the partition alive, but the fact remains, Amritsari kulche is something that's bought in Lahore, and the Lahori halwa in Bombay is called Karachi halwa. So, these are the negotiations we are doing around the clock across the borders, and however hard we are trying to keep the border alive, we are failing.